For 8 years, Sarah Reeves had lived with the torment of an invisible sensation that gnawed at her sanity. It had begun innocuously, a faint, almost imperceptible tickle in her left eye, as though a single eyelash had dislodged itself, dancing across her cornea. She'd blink, rub, flush her eyes with water. Nothing worked. Days turned to weeks, and soon the sensation became part of her daily routine, a subtle but persistent annoyance. Doctors provided no relief. Each visit brought the same response: puzzled expressions, fruitless tests, and empty reassurances. "There's nothing physically wrong with your eye," they'd say, handing her drops for dryness or allergy medications she didn't need. But Sarah knew this wasn't something mundane. It wasn't dry eyes or a stray hair. It felt alive, elusive, something more than anyone else could comprehend. As the years passed, the sensation grew worse. What had once been a light brush against her cornea now felt like countless fine hairs wrapping themselves around her optic nerve, pulling tight with each blink. Sarah could feel it in every quiet moment, gnawing at her focus. Reading, watching TV, working, everything was colored by that constant, maddening feeling. She began to notice other changes too. It wasn't just her eye anymore. Her perception of the world around her seemed subtly wrong. In moments of stillness, she'd feel something behind her, just out of sight, watching. Mirrors became unbearable to look into. There was always the faintest sense that something waited behind her reflection, a fleeting distortion she could never catch. It made her feel trapped, as if the very act of blinking would someday betray her, allowing whatever was haunting her eye to crawl deeper inside. Her friends started to drift away. How could they understand? No one else felt it. No one else saw the darkness creeping around the edges of her vision. They smiled sympathetically, offered advice she had heard 1,000 times before. "Just relax, Sarah. Maybe it's stress." She would nod and pretend to agree, but deep down she knew it wasn't stress. It was something darker. Then came the dreams. They started in faint, disjointed flashes, memories of the nights she and her friends broke into the old, decrepit house at the edge of town. She had forgotten most of that night until now, but as the dreams intensified, the memory of the house grew clearer. It was a dare, a teenage thrill, nothing more. They had laughed and joked as they wandered the empty halls until they found the attic. Sarah's skin crawled as she remembered the mirror. In the dreams, it was always the same. The moment she stepped in front of the mirror, her reflection stared back at her with a gaze that wasn't hers. It was darker, colder. The air around her would thicken, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, just as the dream reached its crescendo, she would feel it. The faintest touch, like a thread pulling at her left eye. Each time, she would wake up gasping for air, her heart pounding, her eye aching with the familiar sensation of those invisible hairs. During the day, Sarah tried to dismiss the dreams as mere echoes of an anxious mind. But the memories wouldn't let go. That house, that mirror. It felt like a doorway, though to where she couldn't say. As much as she tried to push it aside, the thought of that mirror, with its dust-covered frame and cracked glass, consumed her. The sensation in her eye was no longer just an irritation. It was a message. Something had followed her from that night, something that had waited, biding its time. Now it was slowly tightening its grip. The more Sarah tried to convince herself it was all in her head, the more she became convinced that it wasn't. The invisible strands in Sarah's left eye had become more than a torment. They were a constant reminder that something was horribly wrong. Weeks turned into months, and Sarah's world continued to shrink. Her apartment became her sanctuary and her prison. She no longer trusted the outside world, nor her own senses. The feeling of those invisible hairs was no longer confined to her eye. It had spread into her thoughts, her perception, even her dreams. At first, it was subtle. The sensation would flare up whenever she was alone, as if something was watching her, something unseen. She would often catch her reflection from the corner of her eye, staring back at her with a strange intensity, the pupils slightly dilated, almost unnatural. Every time she blinked, she imagined the strands growing, tangling deeper into her mind. Her friends, sensing her detachment, had grown distant. They couldn't understand why she was withdrawing, and they stopped reaching out. Sarah couldn't explain what was happening to her, And even if she tried, who would believe her? She avoided eye contact with them, afraid they might somehow see the darkness lurking behind her gaze. The threads in her eye felt more real when others looked at her, as if they would become visible under the weight of another stare. Her job, once her source of pride and purpose, was now slipping away from her grasp. It started with small mistakes, forgotten emails, missed deadlines. Her coworkers began whispering about her absence from meetings and her distracted behavior. They noticed the way her eyes darted toward mirrors or reflective surfaces, how she would quickly glance away as though something horrible might appear. After weeks of growing tension, her boss had no choice but to place her on leave. "You just need to rest, Sarah," he said kindly, but his eyes betrayed concern and fear. Now isolated in her apartment, the whispers began. At first they were faint, like the rustling of leaves or the quiet murmur of a distant conversation. Sarah would strain to listen, but the words were always just beyond understanding. They seemed to come from the corners of the room, from behind her, or worse, from the mirror in her bathroom. She would stand in front of it, staring at her reflection for hours, waiting for something to happen. She knew it was only a matter of time before the whispers became voices, before the invisible hairs would reveal themselves fully. Sleep was no longer an escape. When Sarah finally drifted off, the dreams were vivid and terrifying, always bringing her back to the abandoned house and the mirror in the attic. In one dream, she stood in front of the mirror, her reflection smiling back at her, though she wasn't smiling. Slowly, her reflection raised a hand to her face, pulling at the corner of her left eye. From within, her double extracted a long, glistening thread, impossibly thin and delicate. As it pulled, the thread unraveled more and more, tugging at something deep within Sarah's skull. She could feel the pressure as it coiled around her brain, tightening. In the dream, she tried to scream, but no sound came out. When she woke, her eye throbbed with pain, the sensation of the invisible hairs stronger than ever. The dreams left her shaken, but they also ignited a new obsession. She had to know the truth about the abandoned house. Something had happened that night, something more than a teenage prank. Sarah began researching the house's history, combing through old news clippings, town records, anything she could find. The deeper she dug, the darker the story became. The house, once owned by an eccentric family, had been abandoned after a series of strange events. Members of the family had vanished without a trace, their disappearances never explained. Rumors spread about the mirror in the attic, an antique piece that had been in the family for generations. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was a portal to another world. Those who stared too long into it reported feeling a strange pull, as if something beyond the glass was reaching out to them. Sarah's heart raced as she read about these disappearances, about people who had felt the same strange sensations she had. It wasn't just her. There was something wrong with that mirror, something that had latched onto her all those years ago. The threads in her eye tightened. She could feel them coiling around her, drawing her closer to some unseen truth. It was as if the mirror was calling her, pulling her back to the place where it all began. The pressure in her eye became unbearable at times, and the whispers grew louder. In the silence of her apartment, she started to hear them clearly. They were no longer just faint noises. They were voices, soft and soothing, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. But the message was clear. She had to return. The more Sarah fought the pull, the more relentless the sensations became. The invisible strands seemed to be in every blink, every shadow weaving themselves into her thoughts, guiding her toward a destination she feared but couldn't resist. The mirror was waiting. The pull was now undeniable. Sarah felt it in every fiber of her being. She no longer had control over her thoughts or actions. The invisible threads in her eye were leading her back to the source, back to the mirror in the abandoned house. Every blink felt like a tightening of the invisible strands, as if something was pulling her closer with each passing second. The whispers in her mind were now more distinct, coherent, rhythmic, almost like an ancient chant summoning her to return to where it all began. One sleepless night, after pacing her apartment for hours, Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. Her left eye twitched uncontrollably, and she saw something, a flicker of movement. For a brief moment, it seemed as if her reflection moved on its own, a split second ahead of her. She blinked, and the invisible hairs tugged violently, sending a sharp jolt of pain through her skull. Her vision blurred, and in that instant, she knew there was no more running. She had to confront the mirror. It was the only way to understand what had been tormenting her for 8 long years. The drive to the house was a blur. She barely remembered getting into her car, let alone the journey through the quiet, desolate streets. The world outside seemed distant, unreal, as though she were driving through a dream. By the time she reached the abandoned house, her hands were trembling, the sensation in her eye unbearable. The house stood as it always had, dark, decrepit, and suffocatingly silent. The front door groaned as she pushed it open, the stale air rushing out like a breath long held. Inside, the house was frozen in time, layers of dust and decay coating every surface. Each step Sarah took echoed eerily through the empty rooms, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. As she ascended the stairs, her mind raced with fragmented memories of that night long ago. She and her friends had thought it was just an innocent dare, a stupid challenge to prove they weren't afraid of a silly old house. But now, as she climbed higher, she realized the truth. There had always been something wrong with this place. The house had been waiting for them, for her. The attic door loomed ahead, slightly ajar, as though it had been expecting her. The sensation in her eye grew sharper with every step. The invisible threads felt almost physical now, pulling her toward the attic with a force she could no longer resist. She could feel them tightening around her mind, like delicate strands of a web drawing her closer to the spider at its center. When she pushed open the attic door, the sight before her took her breath away. The mirror stood in the center of the room, untouched by time or decay. Its ornate frame was carved with intricate, swirling patterns, each detail sharp and unnervingly lifelike. Dust swirled in the dim light that filtered through the cracked attic windows, but the mirror's surface remained pristine. It was as though the very air around it refused to settle on the glass. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't following her movements. It stood perfectly still, its eyes locked on hers. The sensation in her left eye intensified, and she felt the invisible hairs tightening, pulling her closer. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent, their strange language now almost comprehensible. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched the surface of the mirror. The glass felt unnaturally cold, sending a shock through her body. Her reflection smiled, slowly, unnaturally, though Sarah's own lips remained still. A sickening realization dawned on her. The reflection wasn't hers anymore. It was something else, something that had been watching her all these years, waiting for this moment. As she stared into the mirror, her memories began to warp and twist. She saw herself as a child, standing in front of another mirror, this one in her childhood home. She had forgotten that moment until now. It was the first time she had felt the strange sensation in her eye. She had dismissed it back then, but now she realized it had been with her all along. The entity in the mirror had been following her, watching her, weaving itself into her life from the very beginning. Her reflection moved again, raising a hand to its left eye. Slowly, deliberately, it reached in and plucked a long, thin strand from within. The hair shimmered in the dim attic light, impossibly delicate, yet strong enough to tug at something deep within Sarah. She felt it in her mind now, a thread pulling at the core of her very being. The mirror rippled as though the surface of the glass had become liquid. Her reflection's eyes darkened, and Sarah felt a presence behind her, as if something ancient and unseen was standing just out of view. She tried to turn, but the invisible threads in her eye wouldn't let her move. They were pulling her forward, toward the mirror, toward whatever lay beyond the glass. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and in a moment of terrifying clarity, Sarah understood. The mirror wasn't just an object. It was a portal, a doorway to something dark, something that had been waiting for her to return. The entity in the mirror had marked her all those years ago, and now it was ready to claim her fully. Her left eye burned with an intensity she had never felt before, and the threads tightened one last time. Sarah's reflection reached out from the mirror, its hand passing through the glass, its long, thin fingers brushing against her cheek. And then everything went black. Sarah awoke with a start, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around her was blurry, distorted, as though she were viewing it through a cracked lens. She was back in her apartment, but something was terribly wrong. Her surroundings felt unfamiliar, foreign. The air felt thick, heavy, and the quiet was oppressive, like the world had been muffled. The sensation in her left eye was overwhelming now, as if the invisible hairs had woven themselves into her very thoughts. Every time she blinked, it felt like something was tugging at her from the inside, as though the entity she had seen in the mirror was still with her, tightening its grip. The hairs seemed to coil around her mind, making it harder to think clearly, clouding her perception of reality. She stumbled to the bathroom, desperate to see her reflection. She needed to know if what had happened in the attic was real or just some twisted hallucination. The mirror in her bathroom was streaked with water stains, its surface dull from neglect. But when she looked into it, her reflection was clear. Too clear. Her eyes were bloodshot, wild, and her left eye twitched uncontrollably. For a moment, everything seemed normal, until she blinked. In the split second her eyelids closed, she saw it. A flicker of movement, something shifting behind her. She spun around, heart racing, but the bathroom was empty. She turned back to the mirror, and this time her reflection wasn't looking back at her. It was staring past her into the shadows behind her, its expression cold and detached. Sarah's skin crawled. The whispers in her head had returned, but now they were louder, more insistent. They filled the silence around her, a constant hum of voices just beneath the surface of reality. They spoke in that same strange language, words she couldn't understand but felt deep in her bones. The invisible threads in her eye pulsed in time with the whispers, as if they were connected, both drawing her closer to the truth she feared. Days passed in a blur. Time had lost its meaning. Sarah was no longer sure if she was awake or trapped in some twisted dream. The world outside her apartment felt distant, unreachable. She hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Her phone lay abandoned on the kitchen counter, unanswered texts and voicemails piling up. The isolation fed into her growing paranoia, and she started to believe that the world she once knew was slipping away from her, replaced by something far darker. She couldn't escape the mirrors. No matter how hard she tried to avoid them, they seemed to multiply in her apartment, each reflection slightly off, distorted in ways that made her skin crawl. In her bedroom, she caught glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in the corner of the mirror. But when she turned, there was nothing there. The figures only appeared in her peripheral vision, never fully revealing themselves, but their presence was undeniable. The more she stared into the mirrors, the more she saw. It wasn't just her reflection anymore. The shadows behind her were moving, slowly at first, but with increasing frequency. They were becoming clearer, more defined. At times, she thought she could make out shapes, humanoid figures with long, thin limbs, their faces obscured by the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They no longer felt like random murmurs, but a chorus of voices chanting something ominous, something meant for her. She felt their pull, like a force drawing her toward the mirrors. The invisible threads in her eye tightened with each passing day, and Sarah could feel them digging deeper, embedding themselves into her mind. It became impossible to ignore the sensation in her eye. The hairs no longer just brushed against her cornea. They felt alive, writhing beneath the surface, as though something was trying to claw its way out. Every blink was agony, each one a reminder of the unseen force that had taken root inside her. The pressure was unbearable, and sometimes she swore she could feel the threads shifting beneath her skin, coiling around her brain like a puppet's strings. In a fit of desperation, Sarah tried to rid herself of the mirrors. She smashed them all, first with her bare hands, then with anything she could find. The shards of glass scattered across the floor, reflecting twisted fragments of her face, each one distorted and wrong. But the moment she destroyed them, the whispers only grew louder, more urgent. The invisible threads pulled tighter, as if punishing her for trying to sever their connection. It was then that she realized the horrifying truth. The mirrors weren't the problem. They were just a doorway, a reflection of something much deeper. The entity wasn't confined to the mirrors. It had always been with her, woven into her very soul, waiting for the right moment to claim her fully. The sensation in her eye, the invisible hairs, those were just its way of tethering itself to her, slowly tightening its hold over time. Her mind was unraveling, She could no longer trust her senses. The world around her was warped, and reality seemed to shift with each blink. She would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, certain that something was watching her from the shadows, just out of reach. Sometimes she would see it, a fleeting glimpse of a figure, long and thin, standing at the foot of her bed, its eyes glinting in the darkness. But when she turned on the light, it would vanish, leaving her alone with the unbearable sensation in her eye. She began to wonder if she had already crossed over into the mirror's world, trapped in some twisted reflection of reality. The whispers told her that the time was near, that she was almost ready to join them. The threads pulled tighter still, and Sarah felt herself slipping further into the darkness. She couldn't escape. There was no running from the entity that had marked her all those years ago. Sarah's world had completely collapsed into darkness, a distorted reflection of her former life. She no longer knew where the entity ended and she began. The invisible threads in her eye, once subtle and tormenting, were now fully integrated into her body, her mind, her very soul. It was as if they had grown roots, winding themselves deeper into her brain, each thought a tangle of foreign whispers and fragmented memories. The feeling of being watched, of the shadows creeping behind her reflection, was no longer a distant terror, but a constant living presence. The whispers, once disjointed and unintelligible, had become clear now. They spoke to her in a language she could finally understand. They didn't need to coax her anymore. They commanded her, pulling her toward the final act of surrender. One night, after hours of staring into the remnants of her shattered mirrors, Sarah was overcome by a powerful urge. She could feel the invisible threads tightening in unison, the pull now irresistible. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was beyond fear, beyond any emotion except the numbing acceptance that she was no longer in control. The entity had won. She was a vessel, a puppet in its hands. Her body moved on its own, like a marionette guided by unseen strings. She dressed in silence, her hands shaking as she slipped into her coat. The whispers guided her to the door, each step heavy with dread, but her body was moving of its own volition. The house, the mirror, it was waiting for her. The drive to the abandoned house felt like a dream, the world outside her window warped and unreal. Streetlights flickered unnaturally, casting long, twisted shadows across the empty streets. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the destination always just out of reach, but she didn't question it. She knew the entity was guiding her, leading her back to where it all began. When Sarah finally arrived, the house loomed larger than she remembered, its windows like dark, empty eyes staring back at her. The front door was wide open, as if it had been expecting her. Without hesitation, she entered, the weight of the silence pressing down on her as she walked through the decaying rooms. Dust swirled in the air, illuminated by faint moonlight filtering through the cracked windows. Upstairs, the attic door stood ajar, just as it had before, but this time there was no hesitation, no fear. Sarah felt the invisible threads tugging her forward, pulling her up the stairs step by step until she stood once again before the mirror. It was different now. The ornate frame seemed darker, the intricate carvings twisting in unnatural ways. The surface of the mirror was no longer clear, but rippled like black water, shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her reflection stood there, waiting, but it wasn't quite hers anymore. The figure in the glass stared back at her, its eyes hollow, its features twisted into something monstrous. Its left eye was dark, as though consumed by the invisible threads. And Sarah knew that whatever she was looking at was no longer just her reflection. It was the entity itself, fully manifest. The whispers surged, louder than ever before, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices all chanting in unison. They told her what she had feared for so long, that she had never truly escaped the night she first stood before the mirror. The entity had latched onto her that night, slowly feeding off her fears, her thoughts, her soul. And now it was ready to claim her entirely. The mirror rippled again, and Sarah felt the final pull. She stepped forward, her hands reaching out to the surface of the glass. The cold, liquid texture of the mirror enveloped her fingers, and as she pressed her palm against it, the surface gave way as if the mirror had become a portal. The entity in the reflection smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin, and Sarah felt herself being drawn in, the invisible threads pulling her through the glass into the world beyond. As she crossed the threshold, the darkness swallowed her whole. The air was thick, suffocating, and she could no longer hear her own thoughts. Only the whispers, louder than ever, filling every corner of her mind. The mirror's world was cold, a void of endless shadows, and in the distance, Sarah could see faint figures moving, long and thin, their faces obscured. They were waiting for her. Her body no longer felt her own. She was weightless, floating in the void, the invisible threads now fully visible, shimmering and taut, connecting her to the other figures in the distance. They were part of the same web, the same trap, all pulled into this endless darkness by the entity that now consumed her. The last thing Sarah saw before she was fully engulfed was her reflection, standing on the other side of the glass, watching her with cold, empty eyes. The figure blinked, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw herself again, trapped, helpless, a reflection in a world she could no longer touch. Then the reflection turned and walked away, leaving Sarah forever in the darkness. The mirror stood silent, its surface once again still and pristine. But if someone looked closely, they might see, just for a moment, the faintest flicker of movement, something shifting in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to stare too long. And in the silence, the whispers never stopped. Dr. Jonathan Hargrave stepped out of his car, staring at the towering facade of St. Bellamy's Psychiatric Hospital. It loomed over him like a forgotten relic of an older, darker time, its Gothic spires reaching into the overcast sky. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, and the windows were barred with thick iron, giving the place an air of confinement. A chill wind swept through the grounds, carrying the faint, distant sound of rustling trees, almost like whispering voices. The isolation of the hospital struck him immediately. Situated miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forests, it was a fortress of silence. The only sounds inside were the distant clang of metal doors and the low hum of machinery. Hargrave, fresh from his residency in the city, found the silence oppressive. Yet he shrugged it off. He was here for the work that would test his skills and, he hoped, make his name in the psychiatric field. The senior doctors welcomed him with cold professionalism, giving him a brief orientation that felt more like a warning. They spoke in hushed tones, and there was a lingering discomfort behind their eyes when they mentioned certain wards of the hospital. Stay focused, they said. Stick to your routine. Hargrave didn't ask questions. He assumed they were simply battle-hardened by years of dealing with the deeply disturbed. However, it wasn't long before he noticed how their words held a second meaning, one he couldn't quite understand yet. His first few days passed uneventfully, but the sense of something off never left him. The patients were varied, some catatonic, others filled with manic energy, muttering nonsense under their breath. But the hospital itself seemed to breathe, its long, dimly lit corridors winding through the building like the veins of something living. The building creaked and groaned at night, as though shifting its weight. There was one thing Hargrave couldn't shake: the feeling of being watched. Whether in the staff lounge, his private office, or the patient wards, the sensation clung to him. Shadows seemed to stretch a little too long in the dim light, flickering at the edge of his vision. But when he turned, there was nothing. He told himself it was just fatigue, anxiety over starting at a new job. But deep down, a gnawing unease began to settle. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Hargrave was assigned to patient 47, Samuel Covington. The senior staff handed him the file with a strange reluctance. It was thick, filled with pages of evaluations, failed treatments, and cryptic notes. Be careful with him, one of the older doctors advised. Covington isn't like the others. Intrigued but undeterred, Hargrave read through Covington's file late into the night. The man had been committed nearly 10 years ago. His diagnosis: severe delusions marked by violent outbursts. He spoke often of shadows that move and believed they were coming for him. Previous doctors had chalked it up to schizophrenia and tried various treatments, but nothing had worked. Covington had grown more reclusive, more withdrawn, until finally he had stopped speaking altogether. As Hargrave walked through the dimly lit corridors the next day toward Covington's room, the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital weighed on him more than ever. The hallways seemed unnaturally quiet, save for the sound of his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. A low hum of static filled his ears, as if the silence was alive. When he reached the door to Covington's room, he hesitated. A strange feeling gripped him, something he hadn't felt before, an almost instinctual warning. He shook it off. This was his job, and he wouldn't allow himself to be spooked by old stories or institutional gossip. He opened the door. Covington sat in a chair by the barred window, his face gaunt and his skin pale, almost translucent in the weak daylight. His eyes, wishing and unblinking, were fixed on something outside, something invisible to Hargrave. The room felt colder than the hallway, as though the air itself had thinned. "Mr. Covington," Hargrave said, taking a seat across from him. He tried to keep his voice steady, professional. "I'm Dr. Hargrave. I'll be working with you from now on." Covington didn't move. His lips parted slightly, as though preparing to speak, but no sound came out. It was only after several moments of silence that his voice finally emerged, hoarse and barely above a whisper. "They're watching you now." Hargrave felt a shiver crawl up his spine, but he kept his composure. "Who's watching, Samuel?" Covington's eyes flicked toward the corner of the room where shadows pooled in the dim light. His smile was faint, almost mocking. "The shadows," he said. "Once you see them, they follow. They wait for you to turn away." The days following Dr. Hargrave's first meeting with Samuel Covington were filled with unease that Hargrave couldn't shake. Covington's words, "They're watching you now," replayed in his mind over and over again. They seemed to follow him like an echo, haunting him as he went about his work. At first, Hargrave rationalized it away, attributing it to Covington's delusions, a symptom of the man's fractured psyche. But as the days passed, Hargrave's fascination with the case grew into something more unsettling. He found himself drawn back to Covington's file night after night, poring over the cryptic notes left by previous doctors. Most had labeled Covington's condition as incurable, and many had abandoned the case after just a few months. But there was something deeper here, something Hargrave couldn't quite name, but felt in his gut. He told himself it was just professional curiosity, a desire to solve a puzzle that no one else could, but a small part of him knew it was more than that. The hospital, with its long, silent hallways and dimly flickering lights, seemed to mirror the growing obsession within Hargrave's mind. The isolation of the building, surrounded by dense forests and cut off from the outside world, only fed his fixation. In his office, the lamp on his desk cast deep shadows across the room, and Hargrave couldn't help but notice how the darkness in the corners seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. He dismissed it at first, chalking it up to exhaustion. He had been working long hours after all, and fatigue could play tricks on the mind. But the feeling lingered. At night, his sleep became troubled, filled with vivid, disorienting dreams. In these dreams, Hargrave found himself wandering the halls of St. Bellamy's, but the hospital was different, endless, dark, and full of twisting corridors that seemed to lead nowhere. The walls pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, as though the building itself were alive. In the corners of his vision, shadows moved, creeping along the walls, watching him. No matter how fast he turned or how hard he tried to focus on them, they always remained just out of reach, lurking at the edges of his consciousness. Hargrave awoke each morning feeling drained, as though the dreams had pulled something vital from him. But instead of distancing himself from Covington, as a rational mind might have done, he found himself growing more obsessed. He began visiting Covington more frequently, almost daily, sitting with the man in his cold, dimly lit room. Covington rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always about the shadows. "They're closer now," Covington would say, his voice a raspy whisper. "You've seen them too, haven't you?" Hargrave denied it, of course, insisting that Covington's hallucinations were a symptom of his illness. But his own growing discomfort told a different story. He couldn't help but feel that Covington's words held a hidden truth, one that Hargrave couldn't yet understand but felt in his bones. The line between patient and doctor began to blur. Hargrave, once so confident in his scientific approach, found himself questioning what was real. It wasn't just the dreams. During his rounds in the hospital, Hargrave began to notice strange things. Fleeting movements in the shadows at the end of long corridors, a faint rustling sound when he was alone in his office, the flicker of lights whenever he approached Covington's room. These things were subtle, barely noticeable, but they fed into the growing paranoia that gnawed at him. The other patients seemed to sense the change in Hargrave. Some watched him with wide, fearful eyes as he passed, their gazes lingering just a little too long. Others muttered to themselves in low voices, though Hargrave could occasionally catch snatches of their words. Shadows, darkness, they're coming. It was as if the whole hospital shared a secret that Hargrave wasn't yet privy to, but that was slowly becoming his reality. One evening, Hargrave found himself in the hospital's archives, searching for records of previous cases similar to Covington's. The room was cold, the air thick with dust, and the overhead lights buzzed faintly as he sifted through old files. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that he needed to find something, anything that would explain the growing sense of unease he felt. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the brittle pages of forgotten patient records, some dating back decades. Many of the names were unfamiliar, but one thing stood out. There were numerous mentions of shadow visitors. Hargrave's pulse quickened. He pulled several files and spread them across the table. Reading furiously, the descriptions were eerily similar to Covington's case. Patients who had spoken of moving shadows, of being watched, of something crawling just out of sight. Many of these patients had been dismissed as paranoid schizophrenics, and yet there was something more to their stories, something that connected them all. As he worked, the light above him flickered. Hargrave paused, his eyes darting to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to deepen. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something, a shape, a figure standing just outside the reach of the light. His heart skipped a beat and he blinked, hard, trying to clear his vision. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Hargrave's hands shook as he gathered the files and left the archive room. The hallway outside felt longer than before, the shadows darker. He quickened his pace, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but no matter how fast he walked, the sensation followed him. By the time he reached his office, Hargrave's breath was shallow, his pulse racing. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his heart pounding in his chest. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was all in his head, that he was letting Covington's delusions affect him. But the other part, the part that had grown over the past few weeks, whispered something else. It whispered that the shadows were real, and they were coming closer. Dr. Hargrave's world had begun to disintegrate, the steady erosion of his once solid reality taking hold with frightening speed. Days bled into nights, and his routine, which had been his anchor in the chaos, became unmoored. The boundaries between his professional life and his private thoughts no longer held firm. The shadowed halls of St. Bellamy's felt more like a labyrinth, trapping him inside a nightmare than a place of healing. Each time Hargrave visited Covington, the patient seemed more aware of the doctor's crumbling resolve. He would stare at Hargrave with those hollow, unblinking eyes, his gaunt face a pale specter in the dim light. It was as if Covington knew Hargrave was beginning to see the things that couldn't be real. "You see them, don't you?" Covington whispered during one session. "You can't unsee them now." Hargrave no longer denied it. The shadows, once fleeting, now followed him everywhere. They darted in his periphery, elongating unnaturally in the dim corridors of the hospital, but never quite allowing him to focus on them. What frightened him more than the shadows themselves was the way other patients had started reacting to him. On several occasions, as he walked the patient wards, whispers followed him. Low, conspiratorial voices would drift from the patient's rooms, punctuated by sudden silences as he passed by. At first it had been mere murmurs, but then the whispers became more pointed, more specific. Patients, ones he had never interacted with, began mentioning the shadows to him directly. "They've found you," one woman said as he administered her medication. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and her fingers twisted anxiously in her lap. "Once they see you, there's no escape." Another patient, a man in a straitjacket, started screaming as Hargrave entered the room. "Stay back! You're bringing them closer!" He flailed against his restraints, his eyes wild with terror. "They follow you now." The words echoed in Hargrave's mind, feeding the growing fear that gnawed at his sanity. It wasn't just Covington anymore. The entire hospital seemed to be in on some unseen horror that he couldn't fully grasp, but was slowly becoming a part of. The whispers, the looks, the fear, they all seemed to point to one thing, that whatever the shadows were, They had taken a particular interest in him. Hargrave's nights were no longer an escape. His dreams grew darker, more vivid. He found himself wandering through the endless, twisting corridors of St. Bellamy's. But now the shadows didn't just lurk. They pursued him. In his dreams, they were alive, crawling along the walls and floors, moving closer and closer as he tried in vain to run. His footsteps would echo through the hallways, but he could never reach the end. There was always another corner, another stretch of darkness, and behind him the shadows pressed in like a tide, swallowing everything. Each time he woke, drenched in sweat, it felt as though he had left a part of himself in those dreams, as if the boundary between the waking world and his nightmares had thinned to the point of breaking. His colleagues began to notice the change in him. He caught them exchanging worried glances during meetings, their voices lowering when he entered the room. He overheard one of the senior doctors muttering to a nurse that Hargrave was working too hard, that maybe he needed time off. But Hargrave knew better. They couldn't see what he saw. They hadn't been marked. Despite his crumbling state, Hargrave was desperate for answers. He delved deeper into the hospital's history, obsessively researching any mention of shadow visitors. The deeper he went, the more unsettling his findings became. There were reports dating back nearly a century of doctors and patients alike speaking of the same figures. Dark, shapeless beings that seemed to move through the walls, following those who saw them. Most of the accounts ended the same way. The doctors either resigned, disappeared, or were committed as patients themselves. None of them were ever heard from again. Hargrave's research took him to the older, abandoned parts of the hospital, where records had been haphazardly stored in rooms left to rot. Dust hung thick in the air, and the cracked, yellowed walls seemed to close in around him as he sifted through brittle papers and faded photographs. The deeper he dug, the more pieces of the puzzle came together. It wasn't just a psychiatric illness. It was something much older, much darker. One night, as Hargrave sat hunched over his desk, poring through these ancient records, he felt it again. The room grew cold, the hair on the back of his neck prickled, and the air seemed to hum with a low, buzzing vibration. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his head toward the corner of the room. There it was, a shadow darker than any natural light should allow, standing just inside the edge of the lamplight. But this time it didn't vanish when he looked directly at it. It remained a still, silent figure without form, but unmistakably present. Hargrave's breath caught in his throat. His rational mind screamed that this couldn't be real, that it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, by stress. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, the thing didn't disappear. It stood there, watching. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes, but when he opened them again, the shadow had moved. It was closer now, halfway across the room. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling as he clutched the edges of his desk. Slowly, painfully, he reached for the desk lamp, his fingers brushing the cool metal. But before he could turn it, the light flickered. The lamp sputtered once, twice, and then died. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint, pale light from the hallway seeping in under the door. Hargrave felt the air grow colder, the oppressive presence of the shadow pressing in around him. He stood up, heart hammering in his ears, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the floor shifting under his feet, and he realized with growing horror that he couldn't tell if he was awake or still dreaming. The shadows were real now, no longer confined to the edge of his mind. They had crossed over into his waking world. When he finally gathered the courage to turn the light back on, the shadows were gone. But the damage had been done. Hargrave knew deep down that the boundary between reality and madness was fading, and the shadows had found him. They were no longer content to stay hidden. Dr. Jonathan Hargrave's grip on reality unraveled faster with each passing day. He moved through St. Bellamy's psychiatric hospital like a ghost, barely acknowledging his colleagues, his once sharp mind clouded by paranoia and dread. Sleep was no longer an escape, it was a gauntlet. The dreams had grown worse. Now he wasn't just wandering the hospital's endless halls. The shadows which had once lingered just out of sight now chased him through the corridors, moving faster, closer. And each time they caught up, he woke with a jolt, drenched in cold sweat, his chest tight with terror. Hargrave avoided mirrors. There was something wrong with his reflection, something he couldn't explain but sensed deep down. Whenever he accidentally glimpsed himself in the reflective glass of a window or the chrome surface of medical equipment, he saw movement, something shifting in the reflection that wasn't him. It was subtle at first, a flicker of shadow that seemed to creep over his shoulder, but it had grown more distinct, more present. He didn't dare look too closely anymore. He was afraid of what he might see. Covington's words echoed endlessly in his mind. Once you see them, they follow, they wait for you to turn away. Now Hargrave understood. The shadows weren't just watching, they were waiting for him to lose his focus, to slip up. And he was slipping. He could feel it. The line between waking and dreaming blurred, the darkness from his nightmares bleeding into his waking hours. He began seeing shadows move during the day, creeping along the walls of his office, lurking in the corners of patient rooms. The lights in the hospital flickered more often now, and Hargrave couldn't tell if it was just faulty wiring or something more sinister. But when the lights dimmed, the shadows grew bolder, stretching across the floor like long black tendrils reaching out for him. Covington had grown strangely silent. Hargrave still visited him regularly, almost as if compelled by some unseen force. But Covington barely spoke anymore. The man simply sat in his chair by the barred window, his eyes fixed on something invisible beyond the glass, his body rigid with tension. Hargrave tried to question him, but Covington only muttered incoherently, his voice a faint rasp, barely audible. The once talkative patient had retreated so deeply into himself that Hargrave feared he might never emerge again. But it was what Covington did say during one particular visit that sent a cold shiver down Hargrave's spine. "They're inside now," Covington had whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Inside you." Hargrave had recoiled, the words striking him like a physical blow. The shadows weren't just following him, they were becoming a part of him. He could feel it, the cold weight of them pressing against his mind, seeping into his thoughts. His once logical, methodical thinking was now clouded with fear and doubt. He began to question his every action, his every thought. Was this paranoia, or was something darker taking root inside his mind? As the days bled together, Hargrave found it increasingly difficult to tell what was real and what was imagined. He would often find himself standing in the middle of a corridor or his office, unsure of how he had gotten there. Time seemed to slip away from him, and he began to notice strange gaps in his memory. He would look down at his hands and see that they were trembling, though he couldn't remember why. The hospital itself felt like it was shifting around him, its architecture warping in ways that defied logic. Hallways that should have led to familiar rooms now ended in dead ends, and doors that had always been locked were suddenly open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The staff at the hospital had grown increasingly distant. Hargrave could sense their discomfort around him, the way their conversations would trail off when he entered the room, their eyes darting away when he tried to meet their gaze. Once, he overheard two nurses whispering about him in the break room. "He's losing it, just like the others," one of them said. "You've seen the way he looks at the walls, haven't you? Like he's seeing something we can't." "The shadows," the other replied, her voice barely audible. "They say if you see them long enough, they get inside you. They take something." That night, Hargrave stayed late in the hospital. He couldn't leave. He didn't know why, only that he felt an overwhelming compulsion to stay, as if something was waiting for him, and he wandered the halls, his footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. The hospital was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The lights flickered again, casting long, undulating shadows that stretched across the floor like living things. Hargrave froze. There was something different this time. The shadows weren't just moving at the edges of his vision, they were converging, forming shapes. Slowly and possibly, they began to take on human-like figures, dark silhouettes with no distinct features, just empty voids where their faces should have been. Hargrave's heart pounded in his chest as the figures moved toward him, their bodies gliding soundlessly over the floor. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the figures didn't stop. They were all around him now, closing in, their presence suffocating. He felt the weight of their gaze, though they had no eyes, and the air grew colder, thick with an oppressive darkness that pressed in on him from all sides. He ran down the long, winding corridors of the hospital, through hallways that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The shadows followed, their forms slipping through the darkness. Faster now, more insistent. Hargrave's lungs burned as he sprinted, his footsteps loud and frantic in the empty halls. Every time he looked back, the figures were closer, their outlines flickering like dying flames, but somehow more solid, more real with each passing second. At last, he reached in the door to his office and slammed it shut behind him. Locking it with trembling hands, he backed away from the door, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his mind spinning. For a moment, there was silence. The shadows were gone, but he knew they weren't finished with him. In the corner of the room, just outside the reach of the desk lamp's dim light, the shadows began to move again. This time, they didn't stay at the edge of his vision. They crept closer, filling the room with their presence until Hargrave could feel them pressing against him, cold and suffocating. He couldn't run anymore. He couldn't hide. The shadows had found him. And this time, there would be no waking up. Dr. Jonathan Hargrave sat alone in his office, his back pressed against the door he had barricaded, trying to convince himself that the hospital outside was still real. The flickering light of the desk lamp cast weak, trembling shadows across the room, but even the light itself seemed fragile, as if the darkness was slowly devouring it. His hands, cold and shaking, clutched a pen, though he no longer had any intention of writing. His thoughts were shattered, broken fragments of reason and terror that no longer fit together. There was no escaping it now. The hospital, the patients, the shadows, they had all become one entity, a living, breathing nightmare that had swallowed him whole. For days he had fought it, convinced that his crumbling sanity was the result of stress, fatigue, or the pressure of his work. But now Hargrave realized with mounting dread that the truth was far more horrifying. This wasn't madness. This was something far darker, something that had seeped into the very walls of St. Bellamy's and into his mind. And now it was inside him. He couldn't hear the other doctors or nurses anymore. The corridors outside his office had gone unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that gnawed at his nerves and made him wonder if anyone else even existed in this place now. Perhaps they were gone, swallowed by the same shadows that had been stalking him. Perhaps they had never been there at all. The shadows had grown bold. They no longer lurked at the edges of his vision. They stood in the corners of the room, waiting. Their forms were more distinct now, humanoid figures with no faces, just black voids where eyes, mouths, and features should have been. They didn't move, not yet, but Hargrave could feel their intent, a pressure in the air that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. The space between him and them felt thick, charged with a sense of impending doom, as if something terrible was about to happen, but was waiting for him to acknowledge it. He was no longer afraid of them, not in the way he had been before. The terror had dulled into a cold resignation, a quiet knowing that his struggle was pointless. They had been patient, watching him unravel, and now that he was at his weakest, they were preparing to take him. Covington's final words echoed in his mind. "They're inside you." The pen in Hargrave's hand slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the floor. He looked down at his shaking hands, palms up, and saw them trembling, not just from fear, but from something else. His skin was pale, thinner than it had been, almost translucent in the weak light. He could see veins that ran like dark rivers beneath the surface. But worse than that, his fingers were casting shadows on the desk in front of him. But the shadows moved on their own, writhing as if they were alive. Hargrave stared at his hands, horror rising in his throat as the shadows twisted and stretched unnaturally. They began to pull away from his skin, stretching out from his fingers and curling like tendrils along the desk, creeping toward the floor. He gasped, pulling his hands to his chest, but the shadows didn't stop. They continued to pour from him, seeping out from his very being, as if the darkness inside him was finally spilling out into the world. He stumbled to his feet, backing away from the desk, but the shadows followed. They crawled up the walls, slithering like living things, filling every inch of the room with their inky blackness. The figures in the corners moved now, slowly at first, their faceless forms shifting and distorting as they stepped toward him. "Stop," Hargrave whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, stop." But they didn't. They had waited long enough. The shadows wrapped around his legs first, cold and unrelenting. Pulling him toward the center of the room, he tried to fight them, but his body no longer obeyed his commands. The darkness was inside him, controlling him, and his movements were sluggish, like wading through thick black water. He collapsed to his knees, the air in the room thick with the oppressive weight of the shadows. It was as if the very oxygen had been drained, leaving him gasping for breath that would never come. The figures loomed over him now, standing just beyond the dim light of the dying lamp. Hargrave looked up at them, his vision blurring, his mind fracturing as the cold realization set in. He was not leaving this room. There would be no escape from the shadows, no return to the life he once knew. His principles, his logic, his scientific mind, they had all crumbled in the face of this ancient, malevolent force that had been waiting for him all along. "Why me?" Hargrave whispered, though the words were barely audible, lost in the suffocating darkness. One of the figures, larger than the rest, knelt beside him, its faceless head tilting as if studying him. Hargrave's vision darkened further, and as he stared into the void where its face should have been, he saw something, a flicker of movement, a reflection of himself. The shadows were not just around him. They were him. He had been marked long before he ever set foot at St. Bellamy's. The hospital, Covington, the patients, they were merely conduits, bringing him to this inevitable end. With a final shuddering breath, Hargrave surrendered. The cold, invasive presence of the shadows slipped fully into him, merging with his body, his mind, until he was no longer sure where he ended and they began. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls melting into the darkness as the last light flickered out. The door to Hargrave's office remained closed for days after. No one dared to enter. The hospital staff, what few were left, spoke in hushed tones about the strange sounds that had come from the room the night Hargrave disappeared. The low whispers, the flickering lights. Eventually, when the door was open, the room was empty. No sign of Dr. Jonathan Hargrave was ever found. But those who worked in the hospital knew the truth. They had seen it before. St. Bellamy's had claimed another, just as it had claimed so many before. The shadows never left. They only waited for the next to see them. For once you saw the shadows, there was no escape. As twilight descended, painting the sky with streaks of bruised purples and deep blues, the group approached the looming structure of Ravensbrück Asylum. The air felt charged, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath in anticipation. Once a sprawling institution for the mentally ill, the asylum now stood as a decaying testament to the horrors of its past. The building, with its chipped white facade modeled by decades of neglect, looked as if it were weeping. Dark stains trickled down the walls like tears. Harper led the group, her resolve evident in the way she clutched her flashlight. She had spent years researching the institution's dark history, cruel experiments, accusations of inhumane treatment, and whispered tales of the patients who had simply vanished. As she pushed open the creaking front door, it groaned in protest, revealing a wide foyer bathed in shadows. The air was stale, thick with the smell of damp wood and rust, and the chill that crept in felt unnatural, as though it had been trapped inside for years. Lewis, the tech-savvy investigator, was eager to document everything. His voice echoed against the high ceilings as he set up his equipment, capturing the ambiance with a mix of excitement and anxiety. "Let's see what we can find," he said, adjusting his camera. But even his enthusiasm wavered as the first gust of wind howled through the cracked windows, sending a shiver down everyone's spines. Maddie, the historian, lingered near an old patient file cabinet, her fingers brushing against the dust-covered surfaces. As she read through the crumbling papers, her heart raced when she discovered that her great-grandmother had once been a patient at Ravensbrück. "She was committed here," she whispered, her voice trembling, as she looked up at the others, her eyes wide with fear. "They said she was mad, but she was just different." Wallace, the skeptical professor, rolled his eyes, dismissing her words as mere superstition. "We're here for research, not to delve into family legends. Let's focus on gathering real data." But even he couldn't shake the feeling that the asylum was watching them, the shadows shifting around him as if alive. As they moved deeper into the asylum, the oppressive atmosphere pressed down on them, a weight that seemed to wrap around their throats. Flickering lights cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the sound of their footsteps echoed, mingling with a faint humming that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the building. The noise grew louder, a haunting melody that sent chills down their spines, almost as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets of the past. "Did you hear that?" Harper asked, pausing mid-step, her heartbeat quickening. "It's just the wind," Lewis replied, though the unease in his voice betrayed his confidence. Yet as they explored the decaying corridors lined with faded photographs and peeling paint, the feeling of dread deepened. In the old surgical theater, the dim light revealed rusted instruments and a blood-stained table, remnants of the cruel treatments once conducted there. The sight twisted their stomachs, a harsh reminder of the asylum's grim history. And then, as they ventured into the isolation ward, they heard it. A soft, persistent crying that echoed through the halls, a mournful sound that seemed to rise from the very heart of the asylum. It was a childlike wail, full of despair, sending icy tendrils of fear creeping up their spines. Maddie, drawn by the sound, moved closer to the source, her heart racing. "It's coming from down there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Wallace, still clinging to logic, shook his head. "It's just an echo, an old building settling. We're wasting time here." But even he couldn't deny the chill that wrapped around him, making him feel as though they were not alone. As they gathered in the dim light, the atmosphere felt heavy, a palpable sense of dread hanging in the air. With every breath they took, they were stepping further into the asylum's clutches, unaware of the horrors that lay in wait, echoes of past patients, tormented souls trapped in a cycle of suffering and despair. The night was just beginning, and Ravensbrück was hungry for its next victims. As darkness enveloped Ravensbrück, the oppressive atmosphere deepened, wrapping the researchers in a shroud of anxiety. The once vibrant colors of the asylum faded into hues of gray, as if the building itself was absorbing the light around it. Shadows slithered along the walls, twisting and shifting in the flickering glow of their flashlights, transforming ordinary corners into sinister nooks. With their equipment set up, the group dispersed into the asylum's various wings. Lewis ventured into the old surgical theater, where he felt a thrill of excitement coursing through him. He adjusted the camera settings, eager to capture any evidence of paranormal activity. As he focused on the rusted surgical tools, an unsettling whisper floated through the air, causing the hair on the back of his neck to stand on end. He turned abruptly, shining his flashlight into the darkened corners, but found only emptiness. Meanwhile, Maddie found herself drawn to the isolation ward, her pulse quickening as she recalled her great-grandmother's tragic past. The door creaked open, revealing a row of empty padded cells, their walls stained with years of despair. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. She stepped inside, her heart racing, and was immediately struck by a sense of foreboding. "Great-grandma?" she whispered, hoping for some sign of her ancestor. For a moment, she thought she heard her name carried on the wind, faint yet distinct. But as she listened closely, all she caught was a distant, echoing sob. The sensation of being watched crept up her spine, and the walls felt as if they were closing in on her. She fought the rising panic and stepped back, almost colliding with Harper, who had followed her in. Harper, feeling the unease radiating from Maddie, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll find out what happened to her," she said softly, but the words felt hollow in the air. The history of the asylum was dark, filled with tales of neglect and torment. Wallace, having wandered off to explore the old staff quarters, felt a chill race through him as he examined the remnants of faded photographs and dust-covered medical equipment. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that something was lurking just beyond his sight. As he examined an old ledger filled with names, he stumbled upon a disturbing entry detailing unapproved treatments and the disappearance of patients who were never seen again. The hairs on his arms prickled, and he closed the book, a wave of nausea washing over him. Meanwhile, Lewis returned from the surgical theater, excitement sparking in his eyes. "You won't believe what I just recorded. It's like the energy in this place is..." Before he could finish, the humming sound returned, louder and more resonant than before. The lights flickered violently, plunging the hallway into darkness. Maddie gasped as she felt the icy breath of something unseen brush against her skin, and for a moment she swore she saw a shadow flit past her, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes. "What was that?" Maddie shouted, her voice echoing off the walls. "Just the building settling," Wallace replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "We need to stay focused." But the group's resolve was beginning to waver. The sound of crying grew louder, almost pleading, echoing through the asylum. "It's not just the wind," Lewis insisted, his face pale as he gripped his equipment tighter. "There's something here with us." As they gathered in the hallway, the atmosphere became charged with palpable fear. Each member of the group began to experience their own visions, fragments of the past bleeding into their reality. Maddie, drawn to the sounds, wandered deeper into the isolation ward, where the cries transformed into desperate pleas for help. She felt the cold fingers of despair wrap around her heart, overwhelming her with the weight of forgotten pain. "Help me," echoed in her mind, the voice unmistakably her great-grandmother's. The realization struck her like a punch. These spirits were not merely echoes of the past, they were trapped souls, calling out for release. Wallace's bravado began to crack as he stumbled into a darkened room where the air was thick with sorrow. A faint light flickered in the corner, illuminating a cracked mirror that reflected a distorted version of himself, aged and hollow, as if it were showing him what he truly feared. His own voice, trembling and weak, echoed back at him, taunting him. The group reconvened, each member haunted by their own terrifying experiences. "We need to leave," Maddie urged, but her voice faltered as the shadows deepened around them. The walls seemed to throb, live with the weight of memories, and the humming grew deafening. Just then, the lights flickered one last time before plunging them into darkness. The crying morphed into screams, a cacophony of pain that echoed through the asylum, drowning out their thoughts. They were no longer just witnesses to the asylum's horrors. They were now part of it, intertwined with the restless spirits yearning for solace. As they stood together in the suffocating darkness, a chilling realization settled upon them. Ravensbrück was not merely a haunted building, it was a living entity, feasting on their fears and anxieties, drawing them further into its twisted embrace. The night was just beginning, and the asylum was hungry for its next victims. The atmosphere in Ravensbrück shifted palpably as the night deepened, morphing from eerie tension to an oppressive weight that bore down on the researchers. With each passing hour, their senses sharpened, but so too did their fears, awakening dark echoes from within. The asylum seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, feeding off their anxieties and doubts as they ventured deeper into its haunted quarters. Lewis, ever eager to capture the supernatural, set up his equipment in the old common area, where shadows loomed large and whispers danced just out of reach. As he reviewed the recordings from earlier, the soft sobbing he had dismissed became clearer, more defined. A woman's voice, filled with pain and longing. His excitement waned, replaced by a creeping dread that clung to him like a shroud. "Guys, listen to this," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. But when the others gathered around, all they heard was the haunting silence of the asylum, punctuated by the occasional groan of settling walls. Meanwhile, Maddie wandered through the isolation ward, entranced by her great-grandmother's story. The air thickened with sorrow as she traced her fingers along the faded words on the door of one of the padded cells. Memories flooded her mind, visions of her great-grandmother, frail and terrified, pacing the tiny room, eyes wide with desperation. Suddenly, a sharp intake of breath broke through the silence, and she turned to find herself face to face with a fleeting shadow, its features indistinct, but its intent unmistakable. "Help me," the figure whispered, its voice a tortured echo of her ancestors. Maddie's heart raced as she instinctively reached out, but the figure evaporated into the ether, leaving her gasping in shock. Shaken, she rushed back to the others, desperate to share her experience. But when she entered the common area, they were lost in their own spirals of fear. Harper, still reeling from her own haunting memories, clutched a faded photograph of a patient, a young girl with hauntingly empty eyes. It felt as if the girl was staring right through her, demanding attention. What if we're not just experiencing the past? What if it's happening all over again? She mused aloud, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with uncharacteristic vulnerability. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and the shadows seemed to pulse in agreement. Wallace scoffed, unable to accept the implications of her statement. "This is all just psychological manipulation. The mind playing tricks in a place like this," he insisted, trying to maintain his facade of skepticism. Yet as he spoke, the shadows around him flickered ominously, and he felt an icy grip around his throat. In a moment of panic, he turned, finding himself alone in a corridor where the walls appeared to stretch endlessly. The silence that followed felt deafening, and Wallace's bravado crumbled as he stumbled back, disoriented. He caught sight of the mirrors lining the walls, each one reflecting not just his image, but visions of patients, lost souls trapped within the asylum, their eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams. They beckoned to him, urging him to join them in their torment. He turned and ran, heart pounding, desperate to escape the visions clawing at his mind. Back in the common area, Lewis's camera began to glitch, displaying brief flashes of ghostly faces, twisted and tortured, trapped in a loop of agony. His excitement morphed into horror as the reality of what he was seeing set in. "Guys, something's wrong," he stammered, his confidence evaporating. But the others were already spiraling into their own nightmares. Maddie could feel her great-grandmother's presence lingering just beyond the edges of her mind. The cry for help became an insistent mantra, echoing through her thoughts. "We need to uncover the truth," she shouted, desperate to rally the group. But the others seemed entranced by their individual fears, caught in a web spun by the asylum's dark energy. As the night wore on, the haunting melodies of the asylum grew louder, drowning out their pleas for sanity. Each member of the group began to fracture, their inner demons manifesting in terrifying ways. Lewis found himself consumed by guilt over the lives he had failed to save in his previous investigations, seeing their faces twisted in agony, blaming him for his negligence. Maddie, caught in a trance, staggered through the isolation ward, hearing her great-grandmother's voice stronger than ever, urging her to free her from the torment of the asylum. "You must know the truth," the voice echoed, but with each step forward, Maddie felt as if she were being pulled backward, torn between the living and the dead. Wallace's rationality continued to unravel. Alone in the surgical theater, he faced the spectral surgeons, whose ghostly hands gripped scalpels, their eyes filled with a mixture of rage and despair. "You think you can escape?" one of them hissed, their voice echoing through the room. "You're just like us, lost, forgotten." Wallace's scream echoed through the corridors, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. Harper, in a desperate attempt to keep the group together, searched for her companions, but every turn led her deeper into the asylum's labyrinthine grasp. The shadows whispered secrets of the patients who had suffered, and she could feel the weight of their suffering pressing against her chest. "We need to get out," she cried, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony of screams that filled the air, pulling them into the past. In that moment, the asylum revealed its true nature. It was not merely a building haunted by ghosts, it was a living entity, a dark force thriving on their fears, feeding off their pain. The group was ensnared in a web of their own making, trapped in a nightmare where the line between the living and the dead blurred, and the asylum's insatiable hunger grew stronger with each passing hour. As the shadows swirled around them, it became clear that there was no escape. They were trapped within the asylum's suffocating embrace, their minds fracturing under the weight of the past, and the darkness that lurked within Ravensbrück was preparing to claim them all. The night deepened, wrapping Ravensbrück in an impenetrable shroud of darkness, punctuated only by the occasional flicker of fading lights. The atmosphere thrummed with a palpable energy, an unseen force pulling the researchers further into the asylum's sinister grip. Each member of the group had succumbed to their fears, ensnared in a nightmarish reverie that blurred the line between reality and the twisted echoes of the past. Maddie, lost in her desperate quest to free her great-grandmother, stumbled deeper into the isolation ward, each padded cell drawing her in like a moth to a flame. The cries for help morphed into a chorus of desperate voices, filling her mind with their torment. "Help us! Help us!" echoed all around her, and then she felt a familiar cold presence brush against her skin. It was her great-grandmother's spirit, pulling her closer, urging her to confront the dark truths that bound her to the asylum. "Please, I can help you," Maddie cried out, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her palms against the padded walls. "Tell me what you need." The air thickened, and for a moment she felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. The spirits surrounded her, their faces a mixture of hope and despair. They whispered truths, horrors that had unfolded within these walls, secrets buried beneath layers of neglect and abuse. Meanwhile, Lewis, trapped in his own personal hell, wandered through the old common area where the shadows twisted into grotesque figures. Faces morphed into ghoulish masks of the patients he had failed to save, their eyes hollow and accusing. "You didn't help us," they shrieked, their voices rising to a crescendo that echoed through the emptiness. The weight of guilt threatened to crush him, but he fought back, gripping his camera tightly. "I will find the truth," he shouted defiantly, though his voice quivered. Wallace, still grappling with the phantoms of the surgical theater, confronted his own past mistakes. His neglect, his arrogance, and his refusal to see the humanity in his patients. The ghostly surgeons, once cold and detached, now bore a striking resemblance to his former colleagues. They reached out with ghostly hands, pleading for recognition and understanding. "You think you can walk away? You've always been a coward," one of them hissed, forcing Wallace to confront the darkness within himself. In a moment of clarity, Wallace realized that the asylum was not just a place of torment. It was a mirror reflecting their innermost fears. The faces of the patients twisted in agony were not only reminders of their suffering, they were manifestations of the researchers' own failures and regrets. Wallace's heart raced as he understood the true nature of their predicament. They were trapped in a cycle of pain, unable to break free until they faced their pasts. As Maddie reached a cell at the end of the hall, a burst of cold air swept through the corridor, sending chills down her spine. She opened the door, revealing a small, dark room where her great-grandmother had once been confined. The air felt thick with despair, the walls pulsating with the remnants of anguish. "What happened here?" Maddie whispered, desperation tinged with determination. The spirits around her coalesced into a swirling mist, and she could almost make out the figure of her great-grandmother, her eyes wide with terror. "Help me, Maddie," the voice whispered, a haunting echo that filled the room. "You must face what they did to me, to us." As the mist thickened, images flooded Maddie's mind, images of cruel experiments, laughter that masked suffering, and the cold, indifferent gaze of the staff who treated patients as mere subjects for study. Maddie felt the weight of those memories crashing over her like a wave, drowning her in sorrow. "I won't let them forget you," she vowed, her voice a fierce whisper amidst the chaos. "I'll tell your story." Outside, Lewis's camera flickered and buzzed, struggling to capture the malevolent energy swirling around him. He felt a surge of determination as he recorded every horrifying moment, every accusation and scream echoing through the asylum. "I won't be silenced," he shouted, the echoes of the past reverberating in his chest. He turned to the shadows, each one representing a soul yearning for release. "You'll be heard." The voices of the spirits began to harmonize, rising above the din of anguish. "Face us, face your fears," they cried, a chorus of grief and longing. As if in response, the building trembled, the air thickening with tension. The walls seemed to constrict, closing in around them, pushing the group toward a confrontation they could no longer avoid. Wallace, fueled by newfound clarity, rushed into the common area, finding Maddie and Lewis standing amidst the chaos. "We need to unite. We can't face this alone," he shouted, his voice carrying a raw urgency. As the three joined forces, the air grew charged with electricity. The shadows gathered, swirling around them like a storm, their cries morphing into a cacophony of sorrow and rage. Each researcher could feel the weight of their past bearing down on them, the very essence of Ravensbrück entwined with their darkest memories. Together, they faced the maelstrom of shadows, confronting the specters of their regrets. "We acknowledge you! We see you!" Maddie shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You are not forgotten." In response, the shadows twisted and writhed, their screams intensifying as they reached a fever pitch. The building shook violently, the walls echoing with the tormented cries of the past. With every ounce of courage, the group shouted together, "You will be remembered. We will tell your stories. We will tell you." In that moment, the energy shifted. The storm of darkness began to recede, retreating into the corners of the asylum, taking with it the overwhelming weight of their fears. The spirits, once trapped in their torment, began to coalesce into softer, more ethereal forms, their expressions transforming from anguish to relief. As the shadows ebbed away, the group found themselves standing in the center of the common area, their hearts racing but their minds clearer. They had confronted the darkness, faced the pain that had bound them to Ravensbrook, and with that confrontation came a sense of release. Yet the night was not over, and the asylum's true test still lay ahead. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and the flickering lights dimmed, a final warning that Ravensbrook was far from finished with its haunting. The researchers stood together, fortified by their shared resolve, but aware that the darkest secrets of the asylum still lurked just beyond their grasp. The final act awaited, and they knew they had to face whatever came next, together. As the dust settled from their tumultuous confrontation, an eerie silence enveloped Ravensbrook, thick with tension and uncertainty. The energy that had once swirled violently around the researchers now felt stagnant, like the calm before a storm. Though they had confronted their fears, an unsettling sense of dread clung to the air, warning them that the asylum's true power had yet to be unleashed. With adrenaline still coursing through their veins, Maddie, Lewis, and Wallace exchanged determined glances. They could feel the specters of the past lingering, their eyes still watching, waiting for closure. "We have to find the heart of this place," Maddie urged, her voice steady despite the lingering fear. "If we can uncover the truth behind what happened here, maybe we can finally release them." Lewis nodded, gripping his camera tightly as he led the way deeper into the bowels of the asylum. They moved cautiously, each step echoing through the hollow corridors, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. The walls seemed to pulse, almost as if the building were alive, aware of their presence and intent on keeping its secrets. As they descended into the basement level, a chill swept through the air, wrapping around them like a sinister embrace. The corridor narrowed, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights that sputtered ominously. Shadows danced along the walls, forming grotesque shapes that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Wallace whispered, anxiety creeping into his voice. His earlier bravado had begun to wane, replaced by the gnawing fear of what awaited them in the depths below. "We have to keep going," Maddie insisted, her resolve unshaken. "If we're going to help them, we need to know the truth." They pressed on, and as they approached the last door at the end of the corridor, a guttural moan echoed from within, a chilling reminder of the suffering that had once taken place. The door was heavy, rusted with age, yet it creaked open with a low groan, revealing a room steeped in darkness. Inside, they were met with a scene that stole their breath away, a room lined with old examination tables, each stained and cracked, remnants of the horrors inflicted on those who had once called this place home. The air was thick with despair, and as they stepped inside, a rush of cold air enveloped them, carrying the faint sounds of anguished whispers. In the center of the room stood an old chalkboard, covered in scrawled notes and incomprehensible diagrams. Maddie stepped forward, her heart racing as she deciphered the remnants of the past, a record of unethical experiments, the names of patients lost to time, and the torment they had endured. "This is it," she gasped, her voice a trembling whisper. "This is the truth." But as they read the haunting words, the temperature in the room plummeted, and a deep, resonating growl echoed from the shadows. The air crackled with energy as the asylum seemed to react to their discovery, and the walls shuddered violently, shaking loose debris that rained down around them. From the depths of the darkness, a figure emerged, a grotesque manifestation of the pain and suffering that had transpired within these walls. It was a swirling mass of shadows, distorted faces contorted in anguish, and eyes filled with rage. "You dare to uncover our pain?" it bellowed, its voice a cacophony of anguish and fury. "You will suffer as we have suffered." Lewis raised his camera, instinctively capturing the creature's form as it writhed in fury. "We're here to help you," he shouted, though doubt gnawed at him as he faced the embodiment of Ravensbrook's darkness. "You don't have to be trapped here anymore." The creature paused, its multitude of eyes narrowing as it absorbed their words. For a moment, the room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. But the moment was fleeting. The entity roared in defiance, the very ground shaking beneath their feet. "You cannot release us. We are bound by the torment of this place." Maddie stepped forward, her heart pounding as she faced the creature head-on. "No, you don't have to be bound." "Eon, we acknowledge your pain. We see you, and we will tell your story." Her voice rose above the chaos, a beacon of hope piercing through the shadows. You deserve to be remembered." With each word, a light began to glow within Maddie, radiating warmth that pushed back the darkness. The entity hesitated, its fury faltering as it was momentarily drawn to her words. The air crackled with energy as the walls trembled, the light growing brighter with each heartbeat. Lewis and Wallace joined her, their voices intertwining with hers. "We will share your story. We will not forget," they shouted, their determination echoing through the chamber. As they spoke, the light grew, illuminating the room with a brilliant glow that pushed the darkness back, forcing the shadows to recoil. The creature writhed in protest, but the light was relentless, engulfing it in a warm embrace. The anguished faces that had once twisted in torment began to soften, their expressions transforming from rage to relief. "Please, help us," they whispered, their voices now filled with desperation instead of anger. As the light enveloped the creature, it shrieked in a cacophony of sound, the anguish of countless souls rising to a fever pitch. The walls shook violently, but the researchers stood firm, united in their purpose. They focused on the stories buried beneath the pain, the humanity lost to the asylum's darkness. In a blinding flash, the shadows imploded, collapsing in on themselves as the light surged forth. The screams of the tortured souls transformed into a harmonious chorus, echoing through the room, a beautiful melody of release and redemption. The walls trembled, shaking free the remnants of despair that had held the spirits captive for so long. When the light faded, the room fell silent. The researchers stood panting, their hearts racing as they looked around. The heavy atmosphere that had once permeated Ravensbrook had lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The walls, once adorned with the scars of torment, now shimmered with a soft glow, reflecting the transformation that had taken place. "We did it," Maddie breathed, tears of relief streaming down her face. "They're free." But even as they began to process what had transpired, the realization hit them. Their journey was far from over. Ravensbrook's history was still buried beneath layers of neglect and suffering, and the world needed to know. As they ascended from the depths of the asylum, they carried with them the stories of the lost souls and stories that needed to be told. Each researcher, transformed by their experience, felt a renewed sense of purpose. They would not only share their findings, but also honor the memories of those who had suffered. As they stepped out into the night, the oppressive weight of Ravensbrook seemed to lift, replaced by a gentle breeze that whispered promises of healing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the landscape, a reminder that even the darkest places could be touched by light. Together, they walked away from the asylum, their hearts united in their mission to tell the stories of the past and ensure that no soul would ever be forgotten again. The night had changed them, intertwining their fates with the spirits of Ravensbrook, but it had also gifted them with the strength to face whatever lay ahead. And as they stepped into the dawn, the whispers of the past faded into the gentle breeze, leaving behind a legacy of hope, redemption, and the promise that even in darkness, there is always a path to light.